G'day, this is how I built the Jarrah desk for my Year 12 major work. All up, it weighs about 130 kilos. Here's the 3D model that I drop in Fusion. On the back I inlaid a gum leaf shape, and it breaks down to 3 parts so that it can be more easily moved. Here's a deconstruction of one of the pedestals, showing most of the joints in the desk. This is how I built the desk. I had the wood delivered mid-term 4. I marked it up and cut it down to size so that it would fit into the storing better. I used a pencil, steel rule, tri-square and drop saw, as well as a table saw to do this work, and all of the marking cutting throughout my project. I used the drop saw to cut some of the pieces to a shorter length, while my teacher Mr. Stewart ran the wood through a table saw to rip it to width for me. Before using any power tools, I ensured that I had completed the relevant safety training, and while working with power tools such as the drop saw and table saw, I ensured that all standard operating procedures were followed, such as wearing hearing and eye protection and keeping our hands clear of the blades. While marking up the timber, I was careful not to scratch myself on any of the sharp edges of the marking implements. Cutting the wood down to size went well. However, if I were to do it again, I would plan a better indexing system to help me identify the use of certain pieces after they had been cut to length but not to width. Following this, I marked, measured and cut the timber for the sides of my project, first the long stiles, then the rails. To ensure that all my measurements were accurate, I first marked a face side and then a face edge on the timber and based all my measurements off this so that the faces were consistent. Next, I crafted the mortise joins on all my long stiles. I marked them up, being careful not to prick myself on the mortising gauge, and cut them on the mortising drill, keeping my hands away from the blade and wearing ear and eye protection. Fine adjustment on the drill was tricky. I used a mortising chisel on a mortising board, being careful to keep my hands behind the blade of the chisel to clean out the mortise joints. Next, I marked up the tenons on my rails. I cut the first set of tenons on the router table, however it broke later on, so I designed and made a jig that used the plunge router to cut the rest of the tenons. Unfortunately, the jig leaves about 3mm of material on the end of the tenon, which I chiseled off after cutting all of the tenons. Cutting the shoulders for the tenons on the centre rail was done using the bandsaw. It was difficult to mark these up as it was hard to place the tri-square flat on the tenon. I was careful to keep my hands away from the blade of the bandsaw. After this, I fitted each mortise and tenon joint using a mortise chisel, wooden mallet and mortising board. Then I dry fitted all of my frames. Here is a photo of one of my frames in a dry fit. All the rails are square with the sides and the panel is square as well. After marking the half flap joint on the wood following my face side and face edge marks, I cut the tenon of my half flap using the same router jig as I used my mortise and tenon joints, with the stile clamped firmly in place and the router set at a lower depth. I was careful not to put the router back on the desk while it was still spinning. To cut the long rebates for the panels on my frames, I set up a sort of jig on the workbench. I used a plunge router because I had to make 2 passes with the router, starting at a higher depth and working down. Cutting the housing for the half flap joints was a little trickier. I decided to use the trimmer with a jig to speed up the process. First, I had to break the end grain at either end of the housing to stop it chipping out. Then I hooked the jig onto the end of the workpiece and clamped it in place. After routing out the housing while wearing hearing and eye protection, I used a chisel and mallet to clean up and fit the joint. After dry fitting all the joints on my panels, I made the internal support frames for my desk. I marked and cut all of these like my other pieces. Then I marked the rebates with a marking gauge. Because I had to cut so many joints, I decided to use the bandsaw. To make consistently sized and straight cuts, I built a fence for the bandsaw and clamped it in place. My first frame required a little bit of fitting, but after that, all 4 of them came out fine. They were flush and square. Gluing up my side frames was a tricky process. With so much movement and so many pieces, I had to work carefully. I started by sealing the end grain where it was exposed to the joint by rubbing a little bit of glue over it. Then I applied glue to the joints and clamped it all together, being careful to keep the frame flat on the clamps so that it wasn't twisting or bowing. I needed to widen the boards to 290mm for the filing drawers on my desk. I did this with a biscuit joint. I marked these joints, being careful not to put them near the end of the drawers. Then I used the biscuit joiner to cut the holes for the biscuit along the sides. I made sure to connect the dust extraction and disconnect the joiner from the power when not in use. This was a process I used for all power tools. I thicknessed the panels for my drawers, then marked and cut them to length. Next, I used a router and dovetail jig to cut the through-pin dovetail joints. Rushing to finish before the holidays, I made lots of silly mistakes in this process and was luckily able to fix most of them. I then set up the router table and cut the through housings on the back of my drawers. Feeding from the right direction is very important on a router table. Gluing up the drawers was the next step. The tight through housings made this a tricky process, but using some band clamps and sash clamps, I got my drawers glued up, tight and square. Using the CNC was a fairly simple process, but getting the inlay to fit into the trench was much trickier. The CNC had a large dust hood over it for safety. Between the practice and the final cuts on the CNC, I glued up the back panels, making sure they didn't twist or bow. I then fitted the inlay and glued it into place. This took some firm persuasion from a mallet. Using multiple passes at increasing depth on the router, I cut the locking miter joint. This was tricky because of the size of the workpiece. After Mrs. Stewart cut the plywood panels to size for me, I used a tenon saw and disc sander to fit the beading, then I pre-drilled and nailed them into place with some glue. Gluing up the pedestals was a big and tricky job. Pre-drilling the support frames before screwing them into the sides and back was a must. I always wore eye protection when using the drill. Thicknessing the wood for my tabletop was really hard work. Hearing protection was really important for this work. Routing the trenches for the insert tongue and groove joint was made even more difficult after I cut my finger working on the router in a different project. Gluing up my desktop took time, as I did it in 3 parts. First the front two, then the back two pieces, and then all together with the middle piece. I marked, cut, fit and glue the stringers for my draw runners into place so that they would have something substantial to screw into. Then I screwed the runners into place using a piece of plywood as a spacer. Using a router table and the drop saw, I cut the chamfers and mitre joints on my kickboards, then glued them into place. Then I sanded my desk and drawers. Sanding for so long requires a dust mask and hearing protection. I chose domino joints because they would be quick and easy and they were different to biscuit joints. I was careful to alternate between the curvature of the grain on the boards. Using a flush cut bit and a leaf shaped jig, I cut the shapes out of my draw fronts and then used a bearing tipped cove bit in the router table to cut the finger groove. I marked and cut the runners and frames for my desktop using a marking gauge for the half laps. Then tenon saw and chisel to cut the ends and router guide as well as a router. After filling the holes in my desk with clear epoxy, making sure to wear gloves, I applied aquacoat with a foam brush to finish my desktop, pedestals and drawer fronts. I used wipe-on poly for the drawers, sanding between coats for both. I then attached my drawer fronts and assembled my desk.